So thank you, Batsy. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the wonderful trip to Zimbabwe. I think this is a very impressive setup you guys have. So thank you. Thank you for the introduction. The focus will definitely be on avian influenza. And I see I got the after lunch shift. So you guys at the back, I'll try not to bother you. If you need to do some resting, sleeping, whatever, that's fine. We'll just keep it quiet in the front. Let's see. They really should stop taking pictures of you after 25. So this is a map Gary kindly showed you a little bit earlier on. These maps are updated on a very frequent basis, but you can certainly see where the outbreaks of bird flu have been occurring across the world. This particular one I pulled out is the 2023 map. So it shows you all the outbreaks of bird flu across the world between January and the 22nd of July, which is obviously when I prepared my talk. And you can see what's going on there. So what is of interest, this pointer doesn't work, does it? No, sort of. Okay. What is of interest is you can see there's huge numbers of outbreaks across Europe, quite a few outbreaks across the US, and another set of outbreaks that no one seems to discuss very much is Japan had a dreadful season with avian influenza this year. And then the very important one is all those red dots. Gary had them as white dots, which some of them are wild birds, or most of those are wild bird isolates. But the fact that we now have avian influenza in South America, particularly southern Brazil, means that essentially all the important parts of the world have now been affected. And this starts to create risks for all of us in terms of genetic material, imports, and all of those things. We'll come back to the great big gap of lack of outbreaks in the middle of Africa. And I hope I didn't offend the Australians, because nobody really cares about their poultry industry. There we go. So what has been happening with bird flu over the last couple of years? In times gone past, this is the kind of epidemiology we were dealing with until a few years back, is that in essence you had a reservoir of avian influenza in wild birds, and then every now and again the bird flu would mutate slightly and it would develop the ability to infect poultry. And then it would move around amongst poultry in specific areas. We'd kill all the chickens in that area, and then we could pretty much go back to where we were before, and that was a few dead ducks, and in many cases a lot of healthy ducks that were just carrying the virus when they traveled around the world. Later on, what happened is that I'm just trying to check here. Yeah. So what happened then subsequently is that these isolated outbreaks of avian influenza that had penetrated from the wild bird populations started to circulate more regularly within commercial setups. And a very important part of this was live bird markets, and wherever live birds were sold and moved around, they tended to become infected. They tended to then spread the disease from farm to farm. And what has happened, and the reason we see that map, is essentially that this disease is no longer a disease of wild birds that occasionally comes into chickens, but is now really a disease of chickens as well that spreads amongst chicken farms and then, of course, spreads back into wild bird populations. And this makes it a very different disease from what we worked with before the 1980s, where it was really something that it was realistic to expect that we would eliminate from commercial populations of poultry. This is, I hesitate to say endemic, but essentially it's a disease that is continuously circulating in commercial poultry somewhere in the world. So this is why I think the attitudes towards the disease have started to change, and we're starting to realize that simply massacring large numbers of chickens every time we see a few sick ones is not necessarily going to solve the problem. And this is just another way to show that data over time. You can see, I think that goes back to 2017. So the upper graph there is the data worldwide. And you can see that each in the years of 2017, 2021, there were nasty spikes in terms of international outbreaks. And then you can see 21, 22, 23. Every year we were continuing to have outbreaks. So this situation is just getting more and more intense. What I superimposed below that is a graph of the outbreaks reported in Africa. And you can see that with a little bit of imagination, the trend is very similar. You can see that there were outbreaks in 2017, and then 2021, 2022. 2023 looked quite quiet, but I think if we added a few weeks onto that, us South Africans are doing a lot of work to make it look a lot more impressive. So we're right in the middle of a really severe outbreak right at the moment. So yeah, just to make the point again that this disease is getting a lot worse and our ability to control it is not improving based on present strategies. So what I pulled here is just the other important piece of information we know about the disease, and that is that it's very seasonal. So this graph is May to July 2023. And you'll notice immediately that the Japanese seem to have very few cases, that the Americans have very few cases, that the South Americans are clearly still struggling quite a lot. The Europeans seem to have endless cases. I'll come back to that. And you can see that South Africa has suddenly flared up and is causing trouble. So what essentially is happening there is that we're moving from outbreaks in the northern hemisphere winter into outbreaks in the southern hemisphere winter. It's just that there aren't that many of us in the southern hemisphere, so we don't look that impressive. Also, I think the aspect that we have to take into account is how many samples are being tested, of course. And the Europeans are very diligent, even in the summer months, they continue to test. I suspect the Americans during the summer are all at the beach or something like that, so maybe testing is less. But it does also seem that for some reason the second year of the outbreak in the US has been quite a lot less severe than the first year. There are a couple of theories about that, but no one is really sure why it seems to be a lot less severe. And then, of course, South America is still a major concern. You'll notice, of course, that throughout all of these, there's very little going on, as Batsy said, between Southern Europe and Southern Africa. And as we Africans know, that's quite a big piece of land. I know a lot of North Americans think it's quite small. Sorry, this was just a graph that I had showing the US outbreaks in 2022, the blue, and in 2023. And you can see that month by month, or in fact those are weeks of each outbreak, they were losing a lot more birds in 2022 than in 2023. So it's interesting, we don't know why it's less. Could it be that they had better biosecurity in 2023? Could it be that there's a certain level of immunity developing in the wild bird populations? These are just theories. We really don't know. I thought this was an interesting map. And what it shows, please ignore the green numbers. What it shows is the density of chickens around the world. And I think that also, to some extent, explains where you see a lot of the AI outbreaks. You can see that there's really a band of poultry production across China, through the Middle East, and then across into Europe. That's really the bulk of the chickens in the world, and then quite a lot in southern Brazil, and also the eastern part of the United States. So possibly part of the reason we don't see very much happening in Africa, apart from probably inadequate testing, is that there are probably fewer large flocks of commercial poultry across the central parts of Africa. It's interesting that West Africa certainly has large poultry populations, and they do see some outbreaks. And then, of course, down to South Africa, where we essentially have two major populations, the one around Gauteng and the other one down in the Western Cape. So what's happening in South Africa right now? Well, we started off with an H5N1 outbreak in April, and you can see on that particular map the lighter colors are the areas that got affected first, and the darker colors the areas that got affected later. So we essentially had an outbreak around Cape Town, which would be the Western Cape province here. We have a lot of, these were principally laying hens. Then we had a couple of cases here in the George area, a few of these are wild birds, which confuses it slightly. This is actually the George area. We lost 2 sites in that area as well. They were closely related viruses, and we thought that we would probably just see a repeat of the outbreaks that we saw in 21 and 22. That was a very similar virus, and this virus is very similar to the virus or viruses that we're seeing across the rest of the world. And then a couple of weeks ago, we suddenly had an H7N6 outbreak. H7, so all of those red dots that you saw on Gary's map and on my map, about 95 to 99% of those were H5 influenza. There are very, very few cases of other forms of highly pathogenic influenza in the world at the moment. The Mexicans have got a few cases of H7, but the bulk of the rest are H5. South Africa, on the other hand, once again, we have many enterprising citizens with small businesses. I think we have many enterprising viruses with bright ideas to infect chickens. So this outbreak started, sorry I didn't check the dates, but it was probably about a month ago, Gary, now, a little bit more. Yeah. And it started off here. This is Johannesburg, and we have very large poultry populations around Gauteng, Johannesburg, Pretoria, and also into the sort of northwest province is our biggest producing area of poultry. It started in a couple of laying farms to the east of Pretoria. We lost about 300,000 laying hens, commercial laying hens. And then as of last week, still this week, isn't it? We have 3 outbreaks currently, 2 of them in broiler breeder flocks, and 1 of them in another commercial laying flock. And these are all H7N6. Why is this important? Well, it's important because you can use essentially one vaccine for all H5 influenza viruses. And you can probably use a vaccine for all H7 influenza viruses. But you cannot use the same vaccine for H5 and H7. From a vaccination point of view, they are completely different diseases. So the frustration on a personal level for me has been that I've been working with government now for a couple of years, actually, to try and persuade them that we need to look at vaccination as a part of our control strategy. And literally the week before I sat down with them in Pretoria, the outbreak of H7 started. So of course, when I arrived there, they said, so which vaccine is it that you want to use? Yeah. So yeah, welcome to my world. It's always good to be humble and not try to be too confident that you have all the answers. So we're in a difficult position in South Africa, and I've given similar versions of this talk twice before, and at both of those I was quite certain that the strategy was we just needed to get the vaccines, we just needed to get permission to use them, we needed to make sure they worked well, and we would rush forward and we would start vaccinating in South Africa. Now we have to look at a strategy that involves 2 completely separate vaccination programs. I'm not exactly sure how that's going to work out. Look, there are vaccines for both. But it starts to get complicated. So let's go a little further. This is just a particular map that I discovered on the internet. And if any of you are bored and have time on the internet, it's a very interesting map to follow because it's in real time. So as only the Americans can do, they have radar right across America because obviously they're scared of getting attacked by, well, all the countries they've invaded at some stage. So they are able to actually track wild bird migration across the US. And this is just taken at one particular time point. This was 27 May. This is a very high level of wild bird migration. And you see there are 104 million birds in flight across the United States on one night. Can you imagine how easily that number of birds can transmit a virus to absolutely anywhere? I have no idea what the bird numbers are in Africa. I don't think anybody does. But if it's even 10 or 20 million, it's certainly more than enough to move this virus very quickly from place to place. So you can go onto the Birdcast website and you can watch the wild birds migrating across America. Just keep yourself amused and see what they actually get up to. Unfortunately, they can't see the birds in the daylight. They only do it at night. Matter of interest. So if you are planning an invasion of America, you need to do it during the daylight hours. Seems to be the take-home message. This is just a graphic kind of portrayal of what we've been doing with bird flu over the years. These are taken, I think 2 of those are from India, 1 of them is from the United Kingdom, and I'm not even sure where the last one is. But they're random photographs of HPAI control in different parts of the world. The numbers of birds that have been destroyed are just bizarre. You're talking about billions of birds that have either died or been destroyed over the past 10 years. And the irony here is we rush around and kill all these birds and do all the things we do, but we haven't actually reduced the number of outbreaks. It's just getting worse and worse. So clearly the strategy that is being used in the developed world is not entirely successful. We've got to be looking further. I don't know if you can read this, I'm struggling, but basically what it says here is, well, actually I didn't have a picture of a kitten, so I thought I'd put a dolphin on just to make people go, ugh, shame, it's so cute. But the issue here is that one of the concerns that many consumers in the developed world have now is what's happening to all these chickens that we're murdering. We're now murdering millions of chickens. It's becoming socially unacceptable that we continue to murder in these large numbers. And what is also happening with bird flu, which hasn't actually come up prior to this, is a great many isolates of bird flu have been made from non-chickens. So never mind the wild birds, they're now picking it up in sea lions, they're picking it up in dolphins, they're picking it up in sea otters. If you've ever seen a sea otter, that's absolutely the cutest animal in the world. So you wouldn't want them dying from bird flu. So this is also creating a whole social issue around how we control bird flu. We've got to get this sorted out, because either people are seeing dead chickens, or people are seeing dead wildlife, or people are concerned that they're going to become dead wildlife themselves. Because of course this is also a disease that can affect humans. It could be the next pandemic. It is a huge threat. At the moment, the strains that we're dealing with are not showing any tendency to become really dangerous in humans, but it's more than possible that will develop. This particular slide is aimed specifically at all those people who believe that we are going to solve all our bird flu problems by vaccinating. So if you look at that list of biosecurity measures, I think you're probably all fairly familiar with that sort of a list. If you aren't, please consult your biosecurity expert in the chicken industry, because you need to know all of that stuff. Can any of you spot vaccination in there? It's there, but it's only part of the plan. There's probably about 20 items in there that are required to control disease. So biosecurity and all the other things that we do are not going to fall away the day that we start vaccinating. I think Rick also said there's no magic particular feed ingredient you can give to your 50-year-old hen to solve her problems. Equally, there's no magic ingredient you can feed to your chicken or injection, treatment, whatever, that's going to solve all our influenza problems. Vaccination is an important part of this picture, and we do feel strongly, or I feel strongly, that it needs to be used as effectively as possible. I'm not going to give you a lecture on biosecurity. Some of you may be pleased, some of you may be disappointed. But I just thought there are a couple of key points around biosecurity that have become very obvious to me with the change, with trying to control bird flu. And what this shows you is a typical poultry site. And you can see there that at the top you've got the usual shower block. You've got all those access control points. So you would come in, you would shower, you would dip your gumboots, and then you would change your clothes, and then you would walk onto the site. Now, in times gone by, we were more than happy at that point that we'd prevented the disease, whatever it was, from entering the site, right? Okay, because we knew that we weren't part of the problem. You disinfect the truck on the way in, well, that's great. Okay, nowadays, the problem is the disease isn't just out there, outside the site. The disease is in the wild birds. So the moment you've finished showering, you put your clean clothes on, you walk across the lawn, well, what do? You walk through bird droppings. You've got wild birds at the entrance to every house. So how useful was that shower that you took on the way in 5 minutes ago? It wasn't really all that useful. It's a good start. I'm not saying you shouldn't be doing it, but you've got to think that's not the final solution. So what we're looking at nowadays is instead of controlling disease at the entrance to the site only, we're now looking at controlling it at the entrance to every shed. So every shed on your farm has got to be bird-proof. You cannot have any wild birds coming into your farms. So all those little gaps under the house, all those little gaps under the door, those have got to be sealed up. Okay, and I can hear half of you saying, yeah, but it's difficult. Sorry, that wasn't a good Zimbabwean accent, but you understand what I'm saying. It's difficult, right? To get rid of all those holes. The bad news is the influenza doesn't really care about your problems. So if you don't get it right, you remain at risk. So either choose to get it right or choose to live with the risk. This is a really nice graphic. They call it the Danish system. The Americans call it the Danish system. I'm not sure what the Danish people call it. But in essence, what you see here is people coming into a shed. The guys in green are dipping their boots, and then they're very importantly sitting down on a bench. Okay, you notice that? They take their boots off on the clean side, they swing across, and they put clean shoes on the other side and clean clothes. Okay? And the reason that bench is important is because a lot of us have an imaginary line as we come into the chicken house. We call this side dirty and we call this side clean. Okay? But when you come into the chicken house, you think the line is maybe over here, and somebody else might think it's somewhere over here. And the net effect is that you come in with those dirty shoes, and you're basically changing into your clean shoes somewhere in this area, and you've got a great big mess of droppings, and you're bringing a whole lot of stuff into that site. Okay, so that bench gives you a clear line between the clean side and the dirty side. It's not expensive to build, it's very simple, and I know a number of companies in South Africa have implemented that as an additional measure. It's quite effective, and it isn't a major cost. A lot of the layer guys who don't have proper shower units are now using they're using basically spray cabinets where they put a very fine spray onto people who come into their sites. I think that significantly reduces your risk as well. So we've got to keep fighting, we've got to keep thinking about every aspect of biosecurity. I've got clients now who have protocols in the event they find a single wild bird in their chicken shed. They make sure that wild bird is euthanized, they quarantine that shed for 2 weeks. Whatever staff member is working in that shed works only in that shed for 2 weeks, and it remains under quarantine until they're reasonably confident that bird didn't bring bird flu in. I have another client who even has a policy that is, he's a layer client, commercial layers. If a bird falls out of the cage, for whatever reason, the door was left open and lands on the ground, that bird is killed. The argument being that there's a slightly higher risk of getting exposed to manure on the ground. So I'm not suggesting you need to implement all of those things, but what I'm saying is you need to take biosecurity very seriously. And the second point there is that vaccination is not coming to save any of us next week. What are the problems with vaccines? So we'll start with the problems, and we'll get to some of the advantages as well. I'm just not sure where oh, there we go, okay. So this is a nice little paragraph. It says, experimental work has shown that potent and properly administered vaccines increase resistance to and may even protect against clinical signs and mortality and stop egg production. They may even reduce viral shedding from the respiratory and intestinal tracts. Although in experimental studies, a challenge virus is still able to infect and replicate in clinically healthy birds exposed to high doses of AI. So what does that mean? It means you can vaccinate the birds, they stop dying, but they still become infected. So that means that bird is still infected and it's still a risk to the rest of the population. And you have not eliminated it entirely from your operation. And this is one of the things that worries our government particularly. There's also sort of important things in here that says a potent and properly administered vaccine. It has to be the right vaccine, it has to be well made, and it has to be applied correctly. The chicken you didn't vaccinate is not going to be immunized. There's no ways. We know that for every disease, but it still applies for chickens as well. So what goes wrong? Well, vaccinating is costly. Once we start vaccinating, it's going to cost us a whole lot of money. And if there isn't really a risk of bird flu, why would we vaccinate? So we haven't found much bird flu in the middle of Africa. So is the cost really justified? Antigen level. So do you put enough of the right type of virus into your vaccine? Is there enough of it to really protect the birds? Does the antigen, the virus, the vaccine strain, does it actually match? Does it match well with the strains that are prevalent in the area? And what we've been saying in South Africa now is we've just had these H7 outbreaks. We could have vaccinated our entire national flock with H5 influenza vaccine. We wouldn't have saved one bird in Gauteng. Field administration is tricky. Well, it is in the sense that it's tricky because you can't just, if you've got an outbreak, you can't just go in and vaccinate birds. You're probably going to have to start vaccinating birds at least 6 months before you expect the disease outbreak. So in the case of South Africa, to prevent the outbreaks that we're having now, so we expected the outbreak in April, we expected it to be an H5, so we would have had to start vaccinating in basically October last year. Well, we'd have had to finish vaccinating in October last year to make sure that we had adequate immunity in our flocks. We would have been wrong. Gary, I wonder what it would have cost to vaccinate the Astral breeders with H5 last year. A couple of bucks? Okay. So we would have actually spent a couple of $1 million maybe? A couple of million rand carefully vaccinating all our birds for H5, and we would have wasted our time. It's quite ironic. No live vaccines. Okay, one of the rules that no one's arguing with at the moment is you do not rush around vaccinating chickens with live influenza. I don't think anybody's even tried to attenuate it into a meaningful vaccine. All influenza vaccines are effectively dead vaccines. It's a very dangerous disease. You don't want to be messing around with it. But what it usually means in most cases is that you can't get immunity quickly. It's going to be a matter of some weeks between when you vaccinate and when the birds are actually immune. And there's also a strong possibility that you might even have to vaccinate the birds twice. Maternal immunity may interfere with immunity. We're not sure about that. So if we vaccinate a day-old, is it going to work? How long is the immunity going to last? This work hasn't really been done completely yet. Diagnosis and diva problems. The other major worry that the government has in South Africa is once you've vaccinated the birds, how do you know which ones are vaccinated and which ones are actually infected? So you run the risk of a situation where you've got a farm that's well immunized, the birds are not getting sick, they're not dying, but they actually have bird flu. Then you sell those vaccinated birds that are infected, you sell to your neighbor, you sell all around you, and you then actually spread the disease. So it's critically important that we know exactly which birds we vaccinated and exactly which birds are actually sick. And then trade barriers, very important for countries that are exporting. The USA is very worried about this. They're not comfortable vaccinating in the US because that may mean that they won't be able to export. As soon as you start vaccinating, people will use it as an excuse not to accept your chickens. If the USA starts vaccinating, I'm quite sure South Africa will find a way to argue that that's completely unacceptable to import their birds. Of course, we don't want them anyway. Okay, so what are the issues? We've got to put a lot of work into this. It's basically we need to get approval of appropriate vaccines. So we would love to get in and rush in and start vaccinating, but the question is which vaccines? Do they work? How have they been evaluated? And nobody is actually really able to do that work at this point, whether it be in South Africa or in Zimbabwe, because no one is actually considering registering vaccines. So surely it's quite important that we start that process, we start looking at vaccines, we start looking at which ones work, we start doing research to determine which ones are doing the best. Some of that research is being done in Europe. I think I've got some of it. and that information is being developed. But we're talking about work that's going to take a few years. This is a really nice product. Basically what this is, many of you will be familiar with the HVT Newcastle that we give in hatcheries. I think it's quite widely used across many countries. It's a combination of Marek's disease, and it has an insert of a Newcastle, piece of a Newcastle virus. So you immunize your birds with Newcastle, while you can basically produce a similar vaccine with a little piece of bird flu virus in there, which will give you really good protection. This trial shows that if you vaccinate birds with this HVT virus, you get 100% survival even after you challenge them with bird flu. Your contact birds, so even the birds in the rest of the flock, they will also not be affected. There are a couple of other vaccines in there that are less effective. So do we really want to be using a vaccine that's only 30 to 60% effective? We need to be sure we're using the best possible products. And this work needs to get done as quickly as possible. Luckily, a lot of that's happening, particularly in Europe at the moment. Okay, so we need to be sure we use effective vaccines, we need good trial data, and we need good surveillance. In South Africa, we have actually used some H6N2 influenza vaccines. They were fairly effective, but actually to some extent we lost track of what we'd done, what we hadn't vaccinated, and it was a problem. And I'm just trying to think where they are. There are a number of countries that have actually vaccinated, and it hasn't been a success. We'll come back to that. So there's no guarantee that if you start vaccinating, you're necessarily going to make a huge success out of it. Appropriate protocols, we're putting a lot of work into working out how do we perform what we call DIVA tests. How can we be sure which bird was vaccinated, which bird was not vaccinated, which bird is infected? These are all also tests. We need to make sure that there are laboratories that can do that work, whether they be molecular labs or serology monitoring. You've got to have all that capacity to know what is going on. If you don't know what's going on, you're not going to have control of your vaccination process. Which way is it working there? Trade issues, I've already discussed that. A lot of countries are concerned that if they cannot demonstrate they're free of bird flu, they're going to find themselves in a lot of trouble and they won't be able to make it for their export. So just to put a little bit of context back onto it, it's very important to realize that at this stage, governments in the developed world are looking at bird flu and having a conversation about it, but what they're basically saying is, we do not admit that bird flu is endemic. We do not admit that we've lost control of this disease and that everybody can vaccinate however they like. What they're saying is we're still aiming to eliminate this disease from the world, and we are using a variety of techniques, including possibly culling and including possibly vaccination. And we hope that by using those techniques together, we'll be able to actually eradicate bird flu from a particular country. That is the discussion. There isn't a discussion at this point of we're just going to vaccinate all the chickens. And that is why all the rules that come into play here are important. We need to know which are vaccinated. In South Africa, the government, for example, is insisting that if you vaccinate your chickens on your farm, you will not be allowed to sell them alive off your farm. So, for example, if you have laying hens, you would need to keep them on your farm until the end of the laying cycle. At the end of the laying cycle, those birds would need to be slaughtered. They would have to go through an abattoir or they would be killed by hand, but they could not be sold alive. And that is the type of protocol they're looking at throughout large chunks of the world. So it means at this stage that the debate we're having in South Africa is that we would not practically be able to vaccinate commercial layers if those are the rules. So I don't know which road Zimbabwe is going to go down on this, but there's a good chance that you're going to find yourselves down some sort of road along that line. So that'll also be something of a challenge that will have to be dealt with as we go forward. Where it will evolve from there, we don't know. So this is essentially what industry is saying in South Africa is to be part of this eradication program, and then to develop a whole vaccination strategy that would be used as part of HPAI eradication in South Africa. So it's become quite a complicated document, and it also has political implications because we need to give everybody in the industry a fair chance to vaccinate their birds. We can't say only guys with lots of chickens or only guys with extremely valuable chickens can vaccinate. We have to come up with a set of rules that will work for everybody. Again, we're not talking about general vaccination. So we're aiming, and I think in South Africa we're well aware that there's been a commitment within SADC that we will not start vaccinating at this stage. But in South Africa, I think we need to start moving towards a situation where we're allowed to actually evaluate vaccines so that we know when we do start vaccinating exactly what we plan to do. And this will have to be taken up with the rest of the SADC countries. We would then look at a limited vaccine rollout. That means we would vaccinate strategically, and we're looking particularly at high-value birds, so probably grandparents, and also birds in particular areas of the country that have shown a tendency to have a lot of outbreaks would be our second target area. But we have to make sure we can track all of those birds. That means that any farm that wants to vaccinate will have to have very high standards of biosecurity and traceability as well. And then I've already covered the issue of all vaccinated flocks would have to be slaughtered out. We do not see that necessarily as a permanent situation, but that is where we are at the moment. I wanted to come to this slide just to point out that quite a few countries do vaccinate for bird flu. China, Vietnam, and Indonesia probably the best known, and then also Egypt. They all vaccinate, have done for a number of years, and none of them have actually eradicated bird flu. Are there problems? Yes. Again, it depends on the quality of your vaccine. It depends on whether your antigens are correctly matched. How successful is it? Well, in Egypt, I'm led to believe if you operate broiler farms in Egypt, the way they do it is they watch daily mortality, and as soon as it reaches a certain level, they slaughter that flock. They don't check whether it's bird flu, they know it's bird flu. Do we really want to get that far down the road that that's what we have to do? As soon as you're losing 500 birds a day, you drive out there with a truck and you go and slaughter those birds. And that has partly happened in Egypt simply because they didn't control it properly, they didn't eradicate it, they don't know which birds are infected, they don't know which birds are vaccinated. So it can also go horribly wrong. China, I think there's a fair level of success. They've lost very few birds recently. Indonesia is also, in my understanding, fairly chaotic, but they kind of manage. As opposed to losing lots of birds, they just lose some birds. So maybe that's where we need to go, that if you vaccinate your birds, you'll probably be okay. If you don't vaccinate your birds, I guess you probably won't. It's a difficult situation. So yeah, I think the key takeaway here is just that we believe vaccination should be part of the control strategy, but there's a lot of stuff we've got to work out, and we need to get to that as soon as possible. So thank you very much. And to the guys at the back, if you want to go out now, that's great. Thanks for coming.